Last week we talked about a type of behavior toward the environment which focused on spatial adjustment. So we adjust our personal space or we create and defend territory in order to regulate and improve our interaction with other people. Today we're talking about a kind of behavior where we act on the environment to affect its quality, to contaminate it, to preserve it. And so we call this environmentally protective behavior. And we'll be talking about conserving natural resources and protecting the quality of our global and local environments. Now, some of the concerns that have been cropping up in recent years about human impacts on the environment are especially depletion of the ozone layer, which was brought about largely by people using these CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which researchers here at UCI, especially Professor Sherwood Rowland in Earth Sciences, who sadly passed away last month, but he won a Nobel Prize for discovering the hole in the ozone layer in Antarctica. We also have to be concerned about the greenhouse effect and global warming. And what that is that there's so much carbon dioxide production from our cars and from burning fossil fuels, that this creates a kind of heat shield over the environment. It traps the heat of the Earth, but it doesn't let it escape into space. So this is the greenhouse effect, where you have these gases that people are creating through their everyday behaviors, like driving their cars to work, not carpooling, things like that. Human activities create these gases, and then the Earth traps them. And you have this, it's kind of like a greenhouse where you grow plants. The glass of that greenhouse traps the heat inside, it can't escape. And you have a gradual warming of the Earth's environment, resulting in a lot of damage to our natural ecosystems. So how do we get people engaged to try to prevent some of these problems from occurring? Ecological capital refers to these nice natural resources, our trees, our beaches, clean air, and also nutrient-rich topsoil, unpolluted oceans, and these provide services. They help produce fish and other crops that we need, so they're essential for food production. The hydrological cycle cleans out pollutants from our rivers and oceans. So those are the kind of services, the ecological or ecosystem services, that come from these natural resources, this natural capital. Now, one of the ways we can affect ecosystem services is by bringing natural capital to our rooftops. Most cities have this, totally paved asphalt on roofs, large cities, skyscrapers, and there's a growing movement called the Green Roofs Movement, where this is the Chicago City Hall, for example, and this is a public building in Fukuoka, Japan, where there's been a concentrated effort to bring natural capital, the soil, the plants, and in this case the solar panels, which harvest the sun's energy, to the rooftop. These resources do on our rooftops, by bringing that natural capital up to the roof, we have reduced energy costs through natural insulation, the capacity to absorb stormwater, so you don't need as expensive storm drain systems. This helps improve air quality because the plants give off oxygen and they trap carbon dioxide. They create restorative spaces for people and animals. So a lot of times you find birds nesting up here and people going to the rooftop gardens to kind of relax from the urban scene. Gardening, some of the green rooftops have gardening provisions as well. And then it reduces what's called the urban heat island effect, which is the tendency for heat to get trapped by buildings in large cities. And so it helps regulate some of that temperature extreme that you often get in large urbanized areas. So this is an interesting example of using that natural capital to generate and enhance these kinds of ecosystem services. These are the benefits of the natural capital. When we talk about capital, whether it's financial capital that's being invested in stocks to create dividends or profit, or we talk about intellectual capital, you going to college to gain an education and a degree so that your employment opportunities and prospects improve once you graduate. That's intellectual or human capital. Later in the course, we'll talk about social capital, where people invest their time and energy in their social environments or communities to create certain social dividends. And here we're talking about natural capital, where we're investing these natural resources up here on the rooftop to create and enhance these ecosystem services over here. And a lot of times when we value or we try to derive the economic costs of urban developments, we forget that when we put in a parking lot, and County Crows was talking about paving over the parking lot, what happens is you reduce the amount of arable land where you can grow plants and you can produce that oxygen. So the rapid rate at which the world is urbanizing and creating city spaces is often counter to the need to kind of create and protect these ecosystem services. So ecological capital is really the combined store of our natural capital, the soil, the trees, the unpolluted oceans. And some of those are non-renewable resources like oil, minerals that are extracted from ecosystems. And then we have our renewable resources such as fish, wood, drinking water that are produced and maintained by ecosystems. And those are the natural capital. And when you put those together with the ecosystem services that they produce, including climate processes, regulation, the water cycle, recycling of nutrients, generation of soils, pollination of crops by bees and other species, maintenance of a vast genetic library. We have a lot of medications that have come from the Amazon forest because there's such a diversity of species living in that ecosystem. So these are the services that go hand in hand with the natural capital, and together they constitute this ecological capital that we have. So one of the questions for environmental psychology is how do we preserve and protect that natural capital? We also know that world population has really spiked since the 1800s to the present. In 1810, the world reached its first billion population. And you can see what's happened after that. By 1999, we had 6 billion people. By 2011, we had 7 billion people. Now we're going on 8 billion. You can see the rapid rise of population here. And the next slide sort of makes that very graphic. Up to, from all of human history, up to 1800 or so, first billion people, and then the 2nd billion, 3rd billion, 4th billion, and the 8th billion probably by about 2024. And 97% of this population growth in the world is occurring in the developing nations right here. And you can see that the rate of population growth in the developed countries has been relatively flat. And if you look at a country like China with 1.4 billion people, where they've had a very stringent one-child policy, they're facing a demographic challenge in the coming years where they're going to have an overabundance of older people and not enough younger people to kind of maintain that burgeoning economy. So there's some really interesting demographic implications of these policies and regulations. One of the things that I want to say about the rapid growth of human population, on the one hand, it shows that we've made a lot of progress because through medication and public health, people are living longer and we have safer environments in many cases. So in some ways you could say, well, this population increase is going to keep going and we could go 8, 10, 11, 12 billion and not feel a problem. But when you look at the Wynne Edwards article that you read last week on the carrying capacity of an ecosystem, are there some upper limits at which you start to reach limits or problems that set in? For example, the quality of schools and the opportunities for education starts to go down. The global warming, the carbon dioxide production keeps going up. So we have these environmental change problems that start to create certain kinds of disease potentials and hurt crops and increase flooding. So there may be, as Wynne Edwards talked about some decades ago, there may be these sort of ceiling densities or carrying capacities for our human ecosystem. And this population growth can't go on indefinitely without bumping up against those kind of limits. Now, one measure of humans' use of their ecosystem is called the ecological footprint. And it's basically the amount of biologically productive land, for example, nutrient-rich soils, and water areas like lakes and rivers that produce what humans are using and get rid of the waste through prevailing technologies that come from all of that consumption. So it's a measure of human impact on local and global ecosystems, the amount of land required to produce the food, fuel, and fiber to sustain our lifestyle. And it assesses the productive land and marine areas required to produce all these resources we're using, and to absorb the corresponding waste coming from that consumption. Now, global overshoot refers to a situation where we're exceeding the limits of our ecosystem. We're exceeding our biosphere's supply or regenerative capacity. And what that means is that down here, when we talk about planet equivalence, the number of Earths it would take to support humanity's ecological footprint, in 2006, the world's average ecological footprint was 1.4 planet equivalents. And what that means is that we would need 1.4 Earths, or we're using our resources 1.4 times as fast as the Earth can regenerate them. And that number has actually gone up a bit. In 2007, it was 1.5 planet equivalents, which means we're using our resources 1.5 times as fast as we can regenerate them. So if that keeps going up, then the Earth starts to limit its ability to resupply all the natural capital that we're using up. The Earth has about 4.5 biologically productive acres for each person in the world. If you take the 8 billion people, or the 7 billion people right now in the world, and you divide that up per capita, there's about 4.5 biologically productive acres for each person. But in America, our average ecological footprint is about 24 acres or more than 5 city blocks. So there's obviously some real disparities or discrepancies between how quickly our natural capital and our ecological resources are being consumed in different parts of the world, depending on the technologies, the economies in those different regions. Yeah, question. Let's say your name.
Kevin.
Kevin.
You touched upon that point about the disparities of use. When you look at the population curve, there's a lot of population in developing countries, but they use a lot less resources than the developing.
Right, that's a very good point. So in the slide that I showed you, comparing the developing and the developed nations in terms of rate of population growth, even though the population is going up, the per capita consumption of resources is less than what we have in some of the developed countries right here. And that's why you have that 24.5 acres needed per American, whereas there's about 4.5 acres for each person in the world. So we're sort of going way past what you might consider to be the norm, given the number of people we have in the world. We've talked a lot about ecology in the early part of this course, which is looking at people-environment relations as a system, or animal-environment relations as a system. And we can talk about the ecology of pro-environmental or environmentally protective behavior. That's another way of saying it. And there are mutual influences on what we do as individuals to protect or hurt our environment. For example, this green arrow here, which has the double arrowheads, suggests that through our behavior, we're contributing to global environmental change and global warming by, for example, choosing to burn a lot of fossil fuels or not ride-sharing to work. At the same time, the arrow going this way means that the enormity of these changes are sometimes overwhelming us to the point where we give up and we feel helpless to do anything about it. This arrow here, the pink arrow, suggests that social norms and what's going on at the societal level may have a dramatic effect on people's environmentally protective behavior. And we saw that in China, where during the Olympics in 2008, the government mandated that people could only drive cars with even-numbered license plates on a particular day, and the next day only people with odd-numbered license plates could drive. You know, the last digit of license plate ending in an odd or even number. And that dramatically reduced air pollution in Beijing. It also reduced, during that period, emergency room visits and respiratory problems in the population. And that's all been documented through medical research. So if you can create certain kinds of societal forces or norms, they can have a tremendous impact on what we do as individuals toward the environment. And of course, there's an interplay between social norms and what organizations do. Amanda.
I hear so much about what we can do and people talking about it, but going back to getting overwhelmed, has there been any talk of how much longer we have for this stuff to be reversible, for us to have a chance?
There's a lot of talk about that, and I think if you look at our political divides in this country today, some in, let's say the Republican Party, there are a lot of people that would say that putting too much money into renewable fuels and green energy is contributing to our deficit. So they're very concerned about the growth of our deficit in the U.S. On the other hand, you'll have people in the other party saying, well, if we don't do that, and if we don't put that investment in, we only have maybe 25, 30 years before we're going to reach that carrying capacity of the Earth, and everything's going to crash because, we're going to have flooding. Cities like Venice are going to be overwhelmed with seawater, and they're already worrying about that in Venice. They have a flood reduction or reversal program going in that city. So there's a lot of debate about that. And what this brings out, when I talk about whether we're in the interpretive active mode where you're developing a cognitive map of your environment, whether you believe, for example, that there is a problem with global warming or it's trivial and it's made up and we shouldn't do anything about it, those attitudes and those schemas or those perceptions in our head have a lot of impact on what we decide to do through our behavior. So the cognitive interpretive mode and the evaluative mode and the behavior mode, they're all kind of working together. They influence each other. They're not sort of separated exclusively. So our perceptions and our attitudes determine whether we're going to change our behavior or not. And our political ideologies show that there are huge divides in terms of our attitudes in this country about whether environmental change, global environmental change, is a serious problem or it's not. So the ecological approach suggests that there are many layers of influence on our environmentally protected behavior, from the social norms that we encounter in society to the workplaces and organizations where we go to work or we go to school. And just as there's a Green Initiative Fund at UCI, that can affect students' perceptions of this problem, or the Green Roofs movement. So all of those layers of influence, according to the ecology of pro-environmental behavior, are affecting individuals what they decide to do toward their environment. Now, just to give you an example of how social norms or social facts affect these kinds of processes, Emil Durkheim is a very famous sociologist who came up with the notion of a social fact, or a force in society. It could be poverty, it could be environmental injustice, racial discrimination. They're widespread in society, these conditions, and they exert power and influence over people's behavior and well-being. And yet, even though they're objectively observable, a lot of times we're not even aware of them. Individuals don't perceive that there's environmental injustice necessarily. It takes some research by someone like Robert Bullard to document that through his data in Atlanta and other cities in the South. So they're widespread in society. They have this power over us, but a lot of times we don't even perceive it. It's at a social level rather than at a psychological perceived level. Now, these social facts, these norms and conditions in society, do have an effect on what we call psychological facts, our perceptions, our behavior. So, for example, when you have societies going through very rapid change, there's often a kind of breakdown of social norms. Durkheim called this anomie, or dysregulation. And those conditions in society can lead to psychological, individuals' feelings of anxiety, powerlessness, lack of control, and a variety of behavioral dysfunctions, passivity, not wanting to do anything to try to improve the environment, or being depressed about it, not feeling like there's anything we could really do. So the social facts have a very important relationship to these psychological perceptions of ours and our attitudes. In China, as an example, there's a huge number of sources of change happening in that country, from very rapid economic development and poverty alleviation. So there's the growth of China's GDP at tremendously fast rates, massive migration of people seeking employment in the eastern megacities like Shanghai and Beijing. How many of you have been to Beijing or to China, mainland China? Okay, so a lot of you have been there. You've seen some of these rapid changes. Elevated levels of pollution happening in large urban areas. An obesity crisis. You wouldn't think that in China, with a lot of the rice consumption and sort of sensible diets that they've had traditionally, there'd be an obesity crisis. But what's happening? You've got Colonel Sanders and Carl's Jr. being imported into Asia at very fast rates, and we're starting to get an obesity crisis in those countries. Rapid modernization versus historic preservation. That's a tension going on in that society. Bulldozing traditional courtyard neighborhoods to put up skyscrapers where a lot of people can live in a high-rise apartment building. Various ethnic minority and Han majority tensions. Surging rates of internet use, which means that traditional Chinese are being exposed to influences from all over the world because they're connected virtually through the internet. So this is a very large mix of rapid change in that society. And some of those changes are illustrated here, where you've got these traditional courtyard hutong neighborhoods. This symbol here means that this neighborhood is slated for demolition. They're going to get rid of it. And they're going to put up probably a larger high-rise kind of situation. This is one of the ring roads in Beijing, which shows this contrast between rapid modernization and traditional forms of housing and other structures. So these kind of social changes at a very rapid rate create certain challenges for the population, and it makes it more difficult to get everyone on the same page, focusing on whether it's energy conservation or it's a public health initiative or something like that, although they were very successful in doing that around the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And this is, kind of what's happening with the influx of American fast food chains into Asia. Remember, we saw the Morgan Spurlock documentary, Super Size Me. So when you look at these social changes going on in countries like China, and we have a lot of rapid social change in this country as well, and a lot of political divides and tensions and income inequality. It's not like our society is placid and harmonious and equilibrium. A lot of modern countries are going through very rapid change and turmoil. So the American Psychological Association created a task force to study what psychology can contribute to promoting environmental protection, improving the environment. And what they found is that there are a lot of psychological facts or conditions that people experience, a feeling of uncertainty. Is there a problem with global warming or not? Is there enough data to really make that call? Mistrust of messages from scientists or government officials that there is a problem or not a problem. Denial that there actually is a problem occurring. A lot of people believe that climate change is not occurring. Lack of control, a sense of not being able to control what's going on around you. Habits, driving instead of walking or biking. So these are psychological states that have a profound influence on whether we're going to change our behavior toward the environment or not, and they're also influenced by these more prevailing macro conditions in society, the social norms and the social forces. So what does psychology have to say about different kinds of environmentally protective behaviors? From using these energy-efficient light bulbs to investing in wind power, solar power. So we're going to take a look at some of that research today. One distinction that's an important one to be aware of is this distinction between active and passive behaviors or interventions for energy conservation. An active intervention is one where you as an individual have to put out some effort, like turning the lights on or changing your thermostat. So you have to remember to do that actively. A passive intervention is one that doesn't require any individual attention or change in habit. It's built in to the system. So if we want to protect people from automobile accident injuries, we install airbags that inflate automatically when they're in the crash. They don't have to think about that. But at an active level, they do have to think about buckling up their seatbelt. So those are two very different interventions. But by the same token, you can build certain systems into our facilities that turn the lights off when people go out of the room because they have these motion sensors on them. That would be a passive intervention. So we kind of need to harvest both of those when we create new policies to improve energy conservation. We have to be aware of what can people do actively and what kind of building systems and technological systems can be relied on to sort of help them in those efforts where they don't have to think about it as much and they can do the right thing, so to speak, without having to actively contemplate their behavior. Later, Beth Carlin, one of our TAs, is going to present some research that she's been doing on targeting certain behaviors that have a profound impact. They're called high-leverage behaviors. In the home, we know, for example, that a large proportion of energy is consumed by transportation. So the kind of car you buy has a tremendous impact on the energy use of that household throughout the year. And in this particular estimation, it was about 43%, although those numbers change all the time because, for example, as we create more and more technologies with our digital devices that we're plugging into our walls at home, and we're charging our cell phones, and we're charging our iPads and everything else, that's putting more load on those kind of devices. So these proportions change around. But we do know that the type of automobile that people produce, big impact, heavy hitter in terms of what households use by way of yearly energy consumption. By the same token, their heating and ventilation systems, the kinds of air conditioning and heating systems we have in our homes, those are huge consumers of energy throughout the year. So we want to target those kinds of things. And some of those are one-shot installations. You put in the right kind of system, or you buy the right type of energy-efficient car, it gets you dividends in terms of energy conservation and environmental protection throughout the whole year. So Beth's going to elaborate on some of those particular findings a little bit later. Another thing that we have to be aware of is a lot of the research on environmental energy conservation has happened in the residential sector, and yet some estimates are that close to 2/3 of energy use happens in the government and in the corporate sector. So we also have to target those sectors. We can't just try to change the minds and the behaviors of people living in their homes and apartments. We also have to get to the corporate decision makers who make decisions about how to build energy systems into their buildings as passive interventions, for example. Another important distinction between the active and passive categories is the personal and other directed types of environmental behaviors. So a personal example would be you personally take action to modify your energy by turning off the lights in your office when you leave, or a resident decides to participate in a municipal recycling program. So those are things we do personally to affect our environment. Other directed behaviors are things where a person or a group takes action that modifies others' energy use patterns. So this might be a manager at a company deciding to install occupant sensors throughout the building or efficient bulbs, and that affects everybody's energy use. So you don't, as an individual employee, you don't have to decide to do that. The manager's already made that decision for hundreds of employees at a time. By the same token, the city council can vote to implement a curbside recycling program and thereby affect the behavior of thousands of residents. And Irvine, the city of Irvine, has one of those programs. So these are other directed, where people or intermediaries are making those decisions to affect the energy use of a lot of people. These are more personal, individual actions that we can take. So that's an important distinction. You want to sort of draw on both of those and not leave out the key decision makers that are deciding within companies and within government sectors what types of energy to use, what kinds of recycling programs to implement, and those kinds of things. Now, when we look at what are the most effective ways of changing people's behavior toward the environment, there are at least 4 different strategies. One is to pay them, and that's cash rewards. And that proves to be pretty effective in getting people to change their behavior. You could also give them information. You could say, there's a global environmental change problem happening, global warming, and you really ought to do something about it, and ride share instead of drive solo to work to reduce your carbon dioxide production. So that's giving people information. You can also give people feedback, verbally or written, about how much energy they're using. So you get a monthly bill from Southern California Edison, and it tells you what your household has used in the past month, and you can try to modify that or ignore it, So that's feedback. And then you can also praise people. You could give them some strokes for doing the right thing when it comes to the environment. And some of these energy bills that come from Southern California Edison and other municipalities, they'll give you a smiley face if your household reduced your average energy consumption over the last month, but they'll give you a frown if you were sort of an energy hog and you were much higher than the rest of your community. So those are different strategies, and we find that providing information alone doesn't really do a lot. People can tune it out and change the channel and ignore it. You can give people a lot of information about what's good for their health, what's good for the environment, but they're very good at sort of screening it out. So we're going to look more at these different strategies here. When we talk about providing financial incentives, one example of that is here in Sacramento, this municipal utility district pays companies, gives them rebates on equipment that they order for their corporate facilities if they're Energy Star rated. If they're rated as being efficient in terms of energy use, they get rebates, and those add up to corporate savings. Here you've got a home in Irvine where a solar panel installation has been put in. And Southern California Edison also supports that through tax credits. So you can either purchase such a system and pay it off over the years, and your energy savings will, make it worthwhile after about 10 or 15 years. Or you can get companies to come in, install it for free, and then you pay them a certain percentage of your energy bill each month, and you don't even have to invest in it. And overall, your energy savings are enough to justify that additional expense. So these are some ways of sort of providing financial incentives for people to protect their environments at the corporate or at the residential level. And when we talk about rewarding people for a particular behavior to try to shape it up, to make it increase in frequency, a lot of this comes from B.F. Skinner's theory of learning. And he coined the term operant, any behavior by which a person operates on his or her environment. So it's a fancy word for saying, yeah, we affect our environment by polluting it, by conserving our resources, by changing our personal space, establishing territory. We're operating on our environment. Now, what determines whether we keep doing that, whether we keep recycling, or whether we litter when we're driving, is whether we get punished for doing that or rewarded. So that's where this whole notion of incentives comes from. And some of this research came out of Skinner's rat studies, where he had different kinds of animals in these Skinner boxes. And he found that their reinforcement rates in terms of access to food pellets was a way of shaping certain behaviors that he wanted to target and sort of build up. And then by punishing those animals, which sometimes was done through electrical shock or from withdrawal of food, he was able to extinguish certain behaviors. And that would be a kind of punishment schedule. So behavior is shaped or reinforced or extinguished by its consequences. And that's a fundamental assumption of B.F. Skinner. So the idea might be that, well, we can pay people to ride the bus. We can make it worth their while, or we can pay people to put in a residential solar system. And, if we give them enough incentives, they'll do that. So one way that this was applied, and before I give you an example of the bus riding study that you read about today, I want to talk a little bit about the next slide, which is looking at the positive and negative consequences. Here we're going to talk about transportation behavior. Whether somebody decides to buy a Hummer or to ride a bus or train line to work or to bike or take the bus here, all of that depends on a sort of balancing of reinforcers and punishers. You've got these different ways of getting around the city. You can sit in rush hour, drive your own car. One of the reasons that people are deciding to ride their car is there are certain benefits associated with that. You can leave when you want to. You can ride with someone else or you don't have to. You can eat your lunch or listen to an audio tape while you're driving. So you have maximum control over that car environment. Here, when you're taking the bus, less control. You've got to conform to the bus driver's schedules. You've got to make the right change or at least have the right change available. Or driving in a van pool to work. And a lot of companies around Irvine have invested thousands of dollars in creating corporate van pools. So individuals are encouraged to drive in a van to work. And this is an early sort of van pool program from Fluor Corporation over on Michelson and Jamboree. Yeah. So here we've got reinforcing effects of driving your car. Short travel time, high prestige, you can drive your BMW. Choice of travel route. When you leave is up to you. Costs are often deferred. You can put the gas costs on your credit card and not have to worry about it until later. You have more privacy. You can carry more cargo. The advantages of the reinforcing advantages of not driving your car, let's say taking the bus or walking, you've got freedom from responsibilities of driving, parking, and route selection. You get healthful exercise if you're walking or riding the bike. So people are weighing these reinforcers that sort of in their decisions to drive their car or do something alternative. Over here, you've got the punishing effects of driving your car, like getting caught in traffic congestion or the high cost of gas, and they keep going up, versus some of the punishing consequences of walking or biking or not driving. Longer travel times, lower prestige, small choice of travel routes, inflexible schedules, costs, like if you're taking the bus. Costs are immediate. You have to pay as you go. You're more crowded often, less transport space. And sometimes they can be pretty dangerous when you're out on the freeway or surface streets driving your bike around. So you can see that the reinforcers for driving the car are stacked against the reinforcers for not driving. And by the same token, the punishers for not driving are stacked against the fewer punishers for actually driving. So what that means is people typically choose to drive their own car, especially in Southern California where the social norms kind of support that lifestyle. In some cities, they wouldn't support that. If you go to Zurich, Switzerland, there's such a good tram system there and train system. Hardly anybody owns a car or drives it around the city. They're biking or they're on the tram. And that's part of the social norm, what I was talking about before, how the societal conditions affect people's individual behavior. But in Southern California, it's not that way. So in the bus study that we read for today, Peter Everett is a guy I went to grad school with at North Carolina. He was in the experimental psychology wing of our psych department. So he was studying animal behavior, Skinnerian theory, and he decided to get a minor, like I was doing in urban planning, and to apply Skinnerian theory to bus riding and ride sharing. So this is a study that he did at Penn State when he took his first job at Penn State. And what he decided to do was to create two different buses in that community. One that had a big red star, and if you got on the big red star bus, you'd get tokens that you could redeem for merchandise in the town center. The other bus on that same route didn't have a big red star and wasn't giving out tokens. So both of the buses, and you can see some of the things that they could redeem their tokens for. And back in those days, cigarettes were sort of fashionable. They're not anymore. But this was back in the 70s when he did this particular study. Next slide, Mark. So in the first part of the experiment, the first 16 days, the two buses were not distinguished in any way. There was no red star on the experimental bus. Nobody was giving out tokens. During the treatment phase of that study, the experimental bus began to give out tokens. So as people got on the bus, they received a token that they could redeem for merchandise. And there was a big red star on the bus, so people knew that was the one to get on to get their tokens. And this was advertised also in the school paper that they could do this. So during that phase, the rate of bus riding went up 150% in the experimental bus. So this means that, a la Skinnerian theory, you can in fact shape people's bus riding behavior and pay them or reinforce them to rideshare. So that's good news, right? And then when they returned to baseline and got rid of the red star and no more tokens being given out on the red star bus, the rates dropped back to baseline. In other words, the two buses look the same. So does anybody recall a problem that was noticed in the results of that study? So the token reinforcement was very effective in modifying people's bus riding behavior. But what was a problem with it? Aisha?
Was it that the people who were walking, they also started taking the bus too?
Right. So this dotted line here is what the groups were like at baseline. So these columns here are during the experimental phase. You have the token condition where they're getting tokens, and then what that group did when they went back to baseline in the third part of the experiment. So if you compare walkers and car drivers coming into the Penn State campus, the people that really changed during the experimental condition, during the token condition, were the walkers. The car drivers really didn't change that much between baseline 1 and during the experimental condition. So this group really went up in their taking the bus compared to the car drivers. But by the time the experiment went back to the return to baseline in period 3, these people were below baseline 1. The walkers were no longer riding the bus. The car drivers were sort of riding at the same rate they were at baseline 1. And then these breakdowns are by graduate and undergraduate. You had more undergraduates getting on the bus than graduate students during the token phase. You had more trips for academic purposes getting on the bus than those that maybe staff members who were riding to the campus to do non-academic roles. But the interesting thing here is that the Skinnerian token reinforcement strategy was very, very effective in increasing bus riding, but it increased it among the group you really didn't want to elevate bus riding in. These people were already walking. They weren't using any carbon fuels to get to school. And because they knew that they could get reinforced and paid to get on the bus, they chose to do that. So that's a problem with some of these strategies where you pay people to get the reward for doing environmentally protected behavior. They figure out when and how to do that, and as soon as the reward system goes away, they go back to baseline. And by the way, the people you were trying to influence, the car drivers, hardly changed at all between phase 1 and 2. So they wouldn't have known this if they hadn't disaggregated the data by these different categories. But they found out that they had most impact on the walkers, which was not the group they wanted to influence. So sometimes this is called unintended negative consequences of interventions. You know, you're trying to improve some condition in society and solve a problem, and you wind up solving other problems, or you wind up creating other problems. So that's the unintended negative consequence. You're moving walkers off the sidewalk onto the bus so they can get their pay. Now, let me just mention 2 other things about reinforcement schedules. There's a distinction we can draw between contingent reinforcement and non-contingent. Contingent means every time someone gets on the bus, they get 1 token. Non-contingent means every time they get on the bus, they get 12 tokens or 20 tokens. Yes?
Back on the last...
What's your name?
Sean.
Sean. Yeah.
On the last point, do you think that if they would have increased maybe the information of the program through the mass media, now maybe nowadays we have internet and stuff, that they could have got to the auto drivers? Because it seems like maybe the people that walked already took the bus sometimes. Probably it would be reasonable to think if they had to go further than walking distance. So they might have found out that way and it didn't really spread out.
It might be that publicizing the study and the intervention more widely through the internet today might have prompted some of those car drivers to take the bus. But what they argued was that the walkers were already going down that route to get to campus. Maybe they lived in a dorm close by and they just walk over to campus. So it's easy enough for them to hop on the bus, get their reinforcement, whereas somebody driving in from further outside town center, they're saying probably wouldn't have changed their behavior. It would have been too inconvenient to do that just to get a token. So, you know, that's one of the, but it's a good question about whether it was publicizing the study, and if they had done that more, whether more car drivers would have participated. This slide is simply making a point that when you give people non-contingent rewards, in other words, you give them 12 or 20 rewards for doing something like riding a bus, and this was an experimental study over time, you see that the number of tokens returned each time somebody rides the bus is lower for the non-contingent group, the 12 non-contingent tokens, than it is for the 1 token, this is contingent, 1 for 1, which is this line here, or 3 tokens for each one used, which is here. So contingent reinforcement turns out to be a lot more effective than non-contingent reinforcement. Even when you're paying people double to try to change their behavior, if it's non-contingent, they don't make that connection and change the behavior. Another distinction that B.F. Skinner drew was between variable and non-variable ratio reinforcement. And here you've got a bus riding game where variable ratio means you're thinning out the reinforcement rate. Every 6th time you get on the bus in that game, you get a reinforcer. Whereas continuous means every time you get on the bus, you get a reinforcer. Not every 6th time here, but every single time you get that reinforcer. And here they're thinning it out even more. Every 36th time you get on the bus, that's a little lower than continuous. But what this is saying is you can thin out reinforcement or reward schedules and still get the same bang for that buck. In fact, you can get even more compliance because people are working harder to get that reward, even though it's not happening every time. So that's called variable ratio reinforcement schedules versus continuous. And here you've got the baseline where they're not getting any reinforcement at all. Now I want to kind of transition into more of some of the things that Beth is going to go into more detail on. And we're going to talk here about a study done at the Arizona State University on people's use of towels when they check into a hotel. How many of you have seen these kind of things here when you go into a hotel? Okay, so what do they say usually? Yeah, what's your name? Claire. Good point. So Claire is saying that the message that's contained on these towel hanger cards can vary. So this one at the Coeur d'Alene in Idaho says, towels left hanging indicate that you wish to reuse them. Towels placed on the floor will be exchanged with freshly laundered towels. So there's nothing about, oh, protect your environment, or if you do this, we'll do something for you. This hotel that I was just at in Chicago says, help preserve our natural resources. Use your towels more than once to help reduce the amount of water, energy, and detergents we use daily. Hang the towels on the rack if you'd like to reuse them, or leave them on the floor and we'll provide you with fresh towels. Do you think those messages have any effect at all on people's compliance with the request to reuse their towels? and which would be more effective? What do you think? Haruna. Okay, so Haruna's got she's already read this study. Very good. So she's saying that, yeah, you can activate an environmental protection norm and say if you reuse your towels, you're cutting down on the use of energy and detergents. But in the study I'm going to tell you about, what the researchers did is they told the guests that, based on previous data, 75% or so of fellow guests reuse their towels. And as soon as they gave them that descriptive norm of what other people do, it was like people wanted to conform to that and get in line and do the right thing. So that's called a socially descriptive norm, whereas a norm saying do the right thing for the environment is an injunctive norm. It means do it because it's the right thing to do. So this was a very interesting study. What this slide is saying here is they compared the effectiveness of these different kinds of appeals on the towel hangers. And here, so that's pre-behavior normative appeal. You check into the hotel, you haven't used your towels yet, they're giving you a prompt to do the right thing. Post-behavior feedback is like when you get your energy bill from the utility company, and here this person has been an energy hog. They've used all these kilowatts, and so they're calling them out relative to their neighbors and their most efficient neighbors. They've got a long ways to go to be more conserving, and that's in Sacramento. So that's a very interesting kind of approach. Yeah, so these are some of the towel hangers I mentioned to you. This is one from the Hilton hotels over here. So let's look at, if we compare the non-normative prompts, just, if you leave them hanging, we'll change them, or we won't change them. If you put them on the floor, we'll change them. Here they're appealing to this environmental protection norm. Here they're appealing to a social responsibility norm, which is the Hilton family of brands is committed to conserving our country's natural resources. Every day, tons of detergent, millions of gallons of water are used to wash towels that have been used only once. Here's how you can help. So you can help. That's a social responsibility thing. And they say a towel on the rack means I'll use it again, towel on the floor, please exchange. So they're appealing to your being a good citizen or a good neighbor. Okay. So this is a kind of busy slide, but I'm going to, summarize it, I think, fairly briefly. There are 4 conditions in this study that were done by Goldstein, Cialdini et al. At Arizona State University, comparing descriptive and injunctive norms to promote towel reuse. In this first condition, they're saying help save the environment. This is the norm of environmental protection. You can show respect for nature and help save the environment by reusing towels during your stay. 38% of the people that got that appeal complied and reused their towels. The second condition focused on the norm of environmental cooperation. Partner with us to help save the environment. In exchange for your participating in the program, we at the hotel will donate a percentage of the energy savings to a nonprofit environmental protection organization. The environment deserves our combined efforts. You can join us by reusing your towels. 36% of the people that got that norm complied. And so here they're saying if you do the right thing, then the hotel will do the right thing and contribute to an organization that supports environmental quality. Sort of a quid pro quo. This third condition was the descriptive norm condition that Haruna mentioned. Join your fellow guests in helping save the environment. Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate in our new resource savings program do help by reusing their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests to help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay. 48% compliance there. So they were able to get 10% greater compliance by using that appeal, which was pretty neat, because you would think, gee, just giving someone a kind of descriptive norm of what other people do wouldn't be as powerful as the social responsibility norm or the environmental protection norm. But it turned out to be quite powerful. And then finally, this fourth condition was interesting. It was social reciprocity. We're doing our part for the environment. Can we count on you? And so what they said on that message was, because we're committed to preserving the environment, we've made a financial contribution to a nonprofit environmental protection organization on behalf of the hotel and its guests. If you would like to help us in recovering the expense while conserving natural resources, please reuse your towels. So they're saying that the hotel already did the right thing and invested in this positive organization, and you can help the hotel, sort of social reciprocity. They did the right thing, now you could do the right thing and help them recover the costs by reusing your towels. 47% compliance. So these two conditions here, social reciprocity and descriptive social norm, what other people do, turned out to be the most powerful message on these towel hangers for changing people's behavior. Pretty interesting study. Now, what Beth is going to be talking about is a really interesting study done here at UCI where there was a computer-based system installed in some homes in University Hills to give people feedback on their daily energy use. And there are a number of different technologies that can be used to make people aware of their energy use throughout the day. Applications on iPhones where you can keep track of your energy use from your meter. So Beth's going to talk more about this, but the key headline here is that people are more likely to use energy-efficient appliances if they're provided with immediate energy use feedback. So the more you can give them feedback, that's just as powerful as paying them and giving them a rebate. So feedback and praise turn out to be more efficient because you're not using up resources trying to pay people to do the right thing. You're giving them feedback, and that turns out to be just as powerful. It might be descriptive feedback. 75% of the people that come into this hotel reuse their towels, and you jump on board, you do the same thing. So that's pretty efficient, cost-effective. One other point is to tailor these strategies for changing people's behavior toward the environment in accord with social norms and societal conditions. So in China, one of the most active groups for environmental change are the younger population. It's not so much the older folks that are pushing GDP and modernization, but a lot of the younger folks who are more global, they're more virtual, they're connected. They're organizing these movements to protect the environment. And then this is from the Beijing Olympics in 2008, which showed different things that people could do to protect their environment. And that nationwide effort turned out to be really powerful in changing people's behavior during that week. So by summary, I've talked about a lot of different strategies for influencing people's environmentally protective behavior, from identifying the highest impact behaviors for your interventions, targeting high-leverage pro-environmental behaviors. Beth will say more about that. Adopt behavior change strategies that emphasize normative information, behavioral feedback, and social praise. You don't just have to pay people. In fact, that has some drawbacks sometimes. Adopt active as well as passive energy conservation strategies. Target other-directed as well as personal pro-environmental behaviors. So try to influence the decision makers as much as the individual people that are living in a home or working in a company. And finally, tailor your behavior change strategies to the specific cultural context and norms. So that's a pretty good summary of what the research has shown in this area of environmental psychology. And then very last two slides, litter. We haven't talked much about litter and how people despoil their environments. But a key point in this next slide is that when Geller and his colleagues decorated these cans, these trash receptacles, and put them in shopping malls in Blacksburg, Virginia, the non-decorated cans drew less trash. The bird cans drew 15 pounds. The non-decorated cans only 9.34 pounds. So there was markedly less litter observed where the bird cans were, and they were drawing more trash. So by making this trash can more imageable, putting a prompt on it to get people to sort of be aware of this environmental norm, that was a much more effective kind of trash can than just leaving it non-decorated and nondescript. Okay, so we'll take a little break, give Beth a chance to get set up, and then she's going to present about 15 minutes or the last part of class on the research that she's been involved in on behavioral feedback and energy use.
I'm going to talk about, as Professor Sokol said, some of the work that I've been doing with him and a few other colleagues in both the School of Social Ecology as well as the School of Computer Science and Physical Sciences on energy conservation. So when we look at energy use and we look at appeals, how people, as Professor Sokol was talking about, how do we get people to use less energy, to conserve energy? There's some research, a lot of research has shown recently that there's the potential to save as much as 40% of in-home energy use, and that's using more efficient behavior, not just reading by candlelight at night. This is using energy the way we're used to. We can save a lot. So when we look at conservation appeals, we see that people often talk about saving energy as if it's one behavior, or we see a lot of ads that target single behaviors. And there are issues with both of these. With the first, this kind of go green or just save energy appeal, is that conservation, saving energy, isn't one behavior. It's a lot of unique behaviors that take place in the home. If I told you to eat an apple, and there was an apple nearby, you could put it in your mouth and chew on it and eat it. But when I say save energy, what am I actually asking you to do? There are over 500 discrete behaviors that I could be referring to. And then when we think about instead giving people specific targeted behavioral suggestions, there's this propensity towards information overload. How many posters would you need to tell people everything they can do to save energy? So when we pinpoint one thing, like turning off lights when you leave a room, we have a tendency to focus on that one behavior, and people are less likely often to do other things. So is there another solution? And one is to make kind of a short list, like one of the papers you guys read for class, to identify, here are the top 10 things you can do to save energy. But if you notice, even here, within the shortlist article, the Gardner and Stern article, they talked about two types of behaviors, and they talk about immediate low-cost and longer-term higher-cost actions. And those are often what we refer to, those are discussed a lot, what we refer to as behavioral dimensions. So they're this distinction between, for example, turning off lights when you leave a room and changing a light bulb. And most people, including Gardner and Stern and some of their other works, refer to these as curtailment and efficiency behaviors. We actually looked at 28 different definitions of behavioral dimensions, and we found that over and over again we saw this distinction between, for example, driving slower and buying an efficient vehicle, or bundling up in your home when it's cold versus insulating your roof or walls a little bit better. So we wanted to learn more about these different behavioral dimensions. Do people really engage in behaviors differentially, or are there different predictors? So can conservation behaviors be classified reliably looking at actual people? And what variables might best predict? Are there differences in how we engage, who engages in these behaviors? So we conducted a survey. And we asked people about 8 different energy conservation behaviors, and we made sure to include both curtailment and efficiency behaviors. So first, just looking at what people did, we see that there's variation within both the efficiency and the curtailment behaviors. It's not that everybody did one and not the other. Both the most frequent, replacing light bulbs, and the least frequent, checking for thermal leaks behaviors, were reported in the efficiency domain. So it looks like there isn't a big difference if you just look at percent reporting. But what we also looked at is, did they cluster in dimensions? Were there differences in what variables predicted? So not looking at just the reported behaviors, but what other variables correlated with them: gender, age, home ownership, environmental beliefs, motivations. And we did find that 2 primary components, one for our curtailment behaviors and one for our efficiency behaviors, did emerge. And if you see this little behavior off to the side, that was, which did emerge as a third dimension, that was solar panels, which we considered an alternative energy purchasing behavior as opposed to a conservation behavior. So that was a third dimension. And we saw that the predictors of these 2 types of behaviors differed significantly. So we see that the significant predictors for both these behaviors, for efficiency, we saw mainly demographic: gender, age, marital status, and the most significant was whether you owned a home, which makes sense when you think about insulating your walls, when you think about putting in solar panels. But we had behaviors like change your light bulb, check your toilet tank for leaks. These are things that renters can do. So it was somewhat interesting, troublesome to us that people who don't own their homes are not taking advantage of these low-cost behaviors as well. And then with curtailment, we saw almost no demographic variation, but we did see the most significant predictors were environmental motivation. So people had to really care about the environment to do awful things like turning off lights when they left a room. You had to be really dedicated to do that. Like, you have to be a hardcore environmentalist to turn off a light when you're not in a room. So we did find that possibly there are different behavioral models. And in psychology, there are these 2 often, psychology and beyond, psychology and, I want to say Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, often talk about these 2 models for behavior: our head and our heart, right? A rational model and a moral model. And the rational model is really one that targets economic incentives, giving people rebates. Is it in my best interest? So if we want people to conserve, we want to make it in their financial or otherwise personal interest. And the moral model says, no way, you want people to care. And what we're seeing with conservation is that when we broke into these 2 dimensions, we saw both models, but differentially predictive. But we wondered, was it that simple? So we did see this distinction between curtailment and efficiency bear out in our data, but it seemed to draw this line between suffering on one hand and spending on another. And we thought, does it have to be that way? Is this it? Are these our only two options? To bundle up or drive slow, which seems horrible, right? Even worse than turning off lights. Or spend money. Are these really our options? Are they being framed this way, or are they necessarily this way? So are we missing something? So what we did was we actually looked at the definitions themselves, and we looked at the different ways that these dimensions were defined, and we found that they're defined primarily by two variables, by cost and by frequency. And if there are two variables, that means there's four possible cells. So we looked at these two, and we saw that curtailment behaviors refer to frequent, low-cost behaviors. That makes sense, things that you do a lot and that don't cost anything, low to no. And then efficiency tended to refer to high cost or frequent behaviors, things that cost money. But there's two missing cells here. And this third cell we thought was really interesting that wasn't being talked about. And if you look, that it has been talked about. A few authors have talked about maintenance, but nobody in this century. So we did see in the 80s a lot of people saying, no, there's a third dimension, but nobody. What happens often with language, especially with dichotomies, is we tend to just pick up steam and go, it's black or it's white, you're a dog person or a cat person, not noticing that there might be nuance and that there could be something lost in that. We didn't really identify, we haven't yet identified high-cost frequent behaviors. We feel like there's not a large market for behaviors that cost a lot that you have to spend every day. So we're not that concerned about those. If you can think of any, let me know. I'll pass it on to Oprah. But it is possible that there's this third dimension that we're overlooking, that instead of driving slow or buying an efficient vehicle, we could put air in our tires. Instead of bundling up or putting in insulation, we can just plug some of those holes in the wall. And there might be even more. There are a few more recent studies that are looking at distinctions between building envelope, between weatherization, maintenance, and that are these psychologically different, and can we better predict and promote these behaviors. So back to our findings. We did see one variable, and only one variable, that predicted both curtailment and efficiency behavior. And I was personally really excited about this finding because other than this research, one of the main things, as Professor Stokel's mentioned, that I study is the use of energy feedback. And we found that the only variable that was predictive, we didn't doctor this, but we were happy to find it, that was predictive of both types of all conservation behaviors was bill consciousness. Do people pay attention to their energy bill? Which we thought pointed really interestingly at the potential of energy feedback. And energy feedback, I know Professor Stokel's talked about it a little bit, but I think one really great place to learn about feedback is at the grocery store. There are price tags everywhere. There are bright yellow tags when things are on sale. If you want information about the nutritional information, you can pick up any package because it's regulated that you have to get nutritional information. And then when you leave, you get this amazing piece of feedback. You might have never thought of it that way, called a receipt. And it gives you in great detail the exact cost of everything you bought. So if you wanted to spend less money the next time you went to the store, you can look at this and say, man, margarine is expensive. I'm just going to eat my corn with nothing on it. Or you might look at something else. But imagine instead, if you went to the grocery store, you could walk in, grab a cart, fill it up with as much food as you wanted, and just leave. Okay, that sounds good. But then imagine that at the end of the month, you get a bill that looks like this. Thank you for shopping at Safeway. You now owe $527. And you have no idea how much anything costs. How could you possibly make better decisions? And you think to yourself, I ate a lot of top ramen last month, and I also ate a lot of raspberries, and I have no idea which one costs more. And for those of you who don't pay your own grocery bills, ramen is much cheaper than raspberries, just so you know. But this is exactly what happens in the home. We have almost no information about energy use. We get this one silly bill at the end of the month with one number, and we have no idea how much energy is being used. And the cool thing is, there's this awesome opportunity right now. So Professor Stokel's talk showed some kind of old school, kind of experimental door hangers that the experimenters would put in people's windows, but we don't have to actually put little signs in people's windows after reading their meters. This old school meter, for the most part, is being replaced with what are called smart meters. And smart meters mean these old meters, the only way we could get information from one of them is that somebody would have to look at this dial. And the way you would get this bill is the energy company would send somebody out in a truck with a clipboard, and they'd read this number, And then they'd subtract it from the number the month before, and they would put it on that bill for you. And now we can automatically send that information. So it enables us, and this can not only go directly to the utility, but it can go directly into your home. So we see this amazing opportunity for information about our energy use from this meter to be given directly back into us. And as Professor Stokel said, there's a team here that we've been collaborating with that have been designing systems, and we've been testing them as well. This actually, it allows real-time data. This is the display from the UCI at Home system that Professor David Kirkby in the School of Physics invented. This one right here is the now defunct Google Power Meter, and then this is another in-home device. And we can even disaggregate or disambiguate data, because everything that uses electricity has what's called an electricity signature, kind of like a fingerprint. And what we can do is if we pull energy at small enough granular levels as far as temporal granularity, we can actually distinguish between your Xbox and your receiver. So you can actually see how much is being used. Super cool stuff. So when we looked at past research, we found over 100 studies have been conducted, and overall, feedback has been shown to be effective. We also looked at energy at users, and we did some research with about 86 active users of feedback. And we found that they did say things like, I had no idea how much energy computers used. We changed our behavior and started installing power strips. So we think feedback's effective. We think feedback can be effective. Not always. And so this is what we're starting to look at now. This initial research, we found both evidence of a rebound effect and diminishing utility. And a rebound effect is the phenomena at which people tend to consume more services when gains in efficiency are made. So there are some people who have found when people switch to hybrid cars, they sometimes drive even more miles. Or people said, I've wound up using more energy when I see how little they use. We also saw some diminished utility where people said, over half of our sample no longer use their devices. I don't see a purpose for it anymore. I checked every device. It doesn't seem like continued use is useful. So we're investigating when does feedback work? Because we see in studies that it can. So some of our next steps, we're looking at message framing, visual displays, and types of information. So message framing refers to how we frame the presentation of information in a way that encourages or discourages certain interpretations or others. So we're looking at, for example, if we tell you that leaving your router on when not in use will save energy, that might get some people to change their behavior. But what if we told you, but we're not giving you a lot of information. So how many of you have a wireless router at home? And how many of you turn it off when you leave? Well, you should. It saves energy. What if I told you instead it costs money if you leave it on? That might be a more effective message. What if I told you that a router left on all day uses 0.07 kilowatt hours of electricity? Real feedback. Well, it's a kilowatt hour, right? And 0.07 is a small number. Okay, let's translate it to dollars. All right, that's not much, Beth. You're not selling us, right? So what if and this is all identical information, it's just how it's framed. A router left on all day, this is true, use the equivalent of 37 AA batteries. Batteries are not incredibly efficient. Or if I told you if all Americans switched off their router when not in use, we could save almost $3 billion a year. So there are lots of ways of presenting the exact same information that might, again, encourage or discourage certain behaviors. We're also looking at how it's visually displayed. So these are the exact same month of information given in a week or in a month, and then with things to help you get information about the weekend. And then we're looking at different types of feedback. And actually, one student in this class, Cassandra, is Cassandra here? Right there, has been working on a project where we've looked at over 200 devices, her and about a half dozen other students, looked at 200 devices in the market, and are looking at how they're alike and how they're different, and creating a database with our colleagues at Cal IT too. So in closing, energy efficiency, as Steve Chu, our energy secretary, said, it's not just low-hanging fruit. It's literally the fruit hanging on the ground. And we feel like psychology will enable us to see those dividends when engineering and economic solutions haven't. And I'd be happy to talk to any of you about my research. We always have openings. Feel free to email me if you're interested in getting involved. Thank you.